new tools, ways to watch the human brain in action, and a new understanding of intelligence began to emerge. One of the pioneers in this field is Howard Gardner. He proposed the idea of multiple intelligences, a range of abilities that help explain the genius of a Martha Graham or a Mozart, as well as IQ might measure an Einstein. Howard Gardner is now professor of education and co-director of Project Zero at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. He's also an adjunct professor of neurobiology at Boston University School of Medicine, and he's the author of 15 books, including the newly published Extraordinary Minds. Dr. Gardner joins us from the studios of member station WGBH in Boston, and welcome to Talk of the Nation.
Thanks, Neil. Nice to be here.
Joining us from the studios of member station WFCR on the other side of the state in Amherst, Massachusetts, it's Daniel Goleman, who covers the behavioral and brain sciences for the New York Times. He's the author of Emotional Intelligence, a book that builds on the work of Dr. Gardner and others. Dr. Goleman, thank you for joining us.
Quite a pleasure.
If you would like to get in on our conversation, give us a call at 1-800-989-8255. That's 1-800-989-TALK. But let me begin by asking Dr. Gardner in Boston to describe how breakthroughs in neurobiology led to new ideas about intelligence.
Well, as long as we didn't know much about how the brain worked and what the different parts of the brain could do, it made sense to think that maybe the brain was just a collection of horsepower, and if you had a lot of horsepower, you'd be smart. If you didn't have much horsepower, you wouldn't be very smart. But the discoveries of neurobiology, neuroscience over the past decades have made it clear that the brain is a highly differentiated organ with many, many different parts, many, many different networks. And so we began to think about, well, is there parts of the brain that are involved with music or with spatial navigation or with control of one's emotions? Perhaps we ought to think about the intellect as being similarly parcellated. And so a number of people, including me, began to say, well, what could the different intelligences be? And in the book Frames of Mind that I wrote about 15 years ago, I proposed there were 7 different intelligences. There's been some inflation since then, so I now think there are about 8.5 of them.
8.5. What are the new tools that we're talking about? Things like the PET scan, that sort of thing?
That's right. Imaging tools which allow us to take a look at the brain when it's actually functioning, seeing where the blood flows go. And there also are the tools of artificial intelligence, which in a funny way have helped to give the notion of different kinds of intelligence. 30 years ago, when we first began to have computers think, the notion was that computers could be general problem solvers and they could control and solve any kind of problem. But in fact, that turned out not to be the case. Deep Blue may be the most brilliant chess player in the world, but it doesn't seem to know much about anything else. And so in computers, we now have what are called expert systems, which have a lot of knowledge about a certain domain. Might be music, might be language, might be space, might be the natural world, but doesn't have any kind of knowledge about other sorts of things. So we might say there was a convergence in psychology and biology, and also in anthropology. As we look at different cultures and the kinds of things that they value, we also get a notion that what IQ is, it's a pretty good predictor of how you'll do in a Western school. But if you go to another kind of educational system, or once you get out of school, then it's really quite an indifferent predictor. And the notion of IQ hasn't changed in 100 years. Science has changed a lot in that period of time, and I think it's time for the test makers to catch up or get out of the business.
Daniel Goleman, you describe a test given to 4-year-olds that proved to be more predictive of future success than IQ. Tell us about the marshmallow test.
Well, it was quite a surprising finding. I don't know that it predicted success in life entirely, but it was quite startling. The test was very simple. It was done at Stanford University in the late 60s by Walter Mischel. He brought 4-year-olds from the Stanford preschool into a room one by one, sat them at a table, put a large marshmallow in front of them, and the experimenter said to each child in turn, you know, you could have this marshmallow now, but if you'll wait and don't eat it till I run an errand, and when I come back, you can have 2 then. Now, this is quite a predicament for a 4-year-old. Very tough to get through those endless, 10 minutes. About 1/3 of the kids grabbed the marshmallow right away. About 1/3 waited the endless time until the experimenter came back, and they got 2. The payoff finding came 14 years later when these kids were tracked down as they're graduating high school. And they found huge differences, quite significant differences, comparing the two groups. The children who had grabbed the marshmallow at 4, now at 18, were more likely to fall apart into stress, more easily irritated, more prone to getting into fights with other kids. They were still not able to defer gratification in pursuit of their goals. Those who waited, quite the opposite picture, very emotionally balanced. By comparison, they were more popular than the kids who grabbed. They still were able to resist temptation and keep their eye on the goal. But the most striking finding was that the children who waited, compared to those who grabbed, had a 210-point advantage on their SAT scores. Now, 210 points out of 1,600 total is quite a large difference. When I told the people at the Educational Testing Service about this, they make up the SAT, they were astounded. They said that's as large as the difference you see between, say, children from families where the parents have no high school education compared to those from families where the parents have a master's degree. It's a huge difference. So I think it's quite telling that how a child handles impulse would have such an effect on their cognitive ability, on their performance in an academic measure like the SAT. And I think it points to the ways in which the emotional centers of the brain and the neocortex, the thinking brain, are so tightly woven. And the phrase emotional intelligence really refers to how that circuitry operates, how well it operates. And it points to a kind of intelligence which is different from the just top-of-the-head kind, the neocortical thinking intelligence, which is what IQ measures. And if you look at studies that follow people through life, you see that IQ alone just does not predict all or even most of life success, that you have to bring in abilities like how you handle your emotions, how empathic you are, how well you read people. That is emotional intelligence.
Now, I should point out that Howard Gardner's new book is just out, called Extraordinary Minds, but as he said, his other book, Frames of Mind, or his first book, Frames of Mind, was out some 15 years ago. Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence, came out a couple of years ago. It's been extraordinarily successful, and congratulations, Dr. Goleman.
Thank you. I was surprised.
But I have to ask, you're both obviously aware of each other's work. Any major conflicts? Howard Gardner, you think he got it wrong?
I've actually been in contact with Dan since I think the book was only a glint in his eye, and I find myself very, very largely in agreement with what he has to say. I think if I wanted to pick a fight, I'd pick it around what I think is a too easy oscillation between emotional intelligence as a description, namely, how well do you understand yourself? How well do you understand other people? How well can you control your emotions? And emotional intelligence as a prescription, how you should be, how you should behave toward other people, how you should behave toward yourself. I completely share Dan's pro-social goal of helping people to get along better and to be able to control themselves better. But I think you could be emotionally intelligent in Dan's terms and be a bastard. In fact, looking at his list today, I realized that in many ways Hitler was emotionally intelligent. So I guess I'd like to hear how Dan handles the prescription-description tension.
It's an interesting objection. I should say that also our relationship goes back to graduate school. We were together at Harvard years and years ago, and the seminal ideas on which emotional intelligence, from which it grew, really are Howard's. That is his... I think the breakthrough concept was seeing that there's a spread of intelligences, that IQ alone just doesn't do justice to the ways people can be competent in the world. And I've actually struggled with the question Howard raises. I think it's quite a good one. And I would point to one fact, and that is that it isn't as though emotional intelligence were one ability. There are 5 different domains. There's self-awareness, there's how you handle emotions, particularly distressing ones, there's motivation, there's empathy, and then there's social skill. I would say that anyone who is a charismatic leader, like a dictator like Hitler, who can rouse crowds to emotional passion, has the 5th, but is deficient in a key element of the 4th, empathy, because empathy ordinarily leads to caring and compassion. And people who are Machiavellian, who use their social skill to manipulate people toward evil ends, I think are deficient in emotional intelligence, at least as far as empathy is concerned. So I'd say that in one way they're skilled, but in another way they're quite unskilled.
I was actually going to use the example of Professor Moriarty rather than Adolf Hitler, but I guess the point comes across. Dr. Gardner, do you think, as Dan Goleman does, that these skills, these different intelligences, can be nurtured and developed in children?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think some of the intelligences I look at, like, let's say, mathematical or musical, might be quite heritable. That is, it really matters a lot who your biological parents are if you're going to become a great mathematician or a great musician, like Mozart. Mm-hmm. I think, on the other hand, I don't think anybody is born with a particular sensitivity toward other people, or for that matter, with a particular control of his or her own emotions. So I think it really is child rearing, pure and simple. I don't know, Dan might know whether the marshmallow study has been done in other cultures. I would guess, for example, that if it were done in East Asian cultures, you'd have a very high percentage of people who would not go for the marshmallow until until later on. And that's not because the brains are different, it's because self-control is an enormous virtue there. I was recently in Singapore. They wanted to photograph me with an 8-month-old child, and I knew that the way to get a child not to be scared of a stranger is not to look in his eyes and to give him your glasses to play with. That child would not touch my glasses, and I began to ask around, and by the age of 8 months in Singapore, those kids learn not to grab things that don't belong to them. That's not built into the Singapore brain, and I can assure you if the child were born in Singapore of Singaporean parents and raised in, say, suburban Chicago, they wouldn't be doing the same things. Now, I think this is absolutely nurturable, and I think a lot of the excitement about Dan's ideas occurs in school, in educational circles, where whatever the case was 50 or 100 years ago, we know now that many kids aren't empathic, they aren't in control of themselves, they can't resolve conflicts peacefully. And even if emotional intelligence was traditionally trained at home, in religion, for all I know by the media, it isn't anymore. And so if we don't essentially do it in the few institutions which we still have some control over, like the schools, we're going to have a population that's emotionally very stupid.
Our phone number is 1-800-989-8255. That's 1-800-989-TALK. And Dan Goleman, perhaps we would understand the educational aspects of this better if we use the other word that you use to define these emotional intelligences, and that's character. Can you teach character?
Well, I don't equate the two. I see a relationship between these emotional competencies, which are specific skills, and what is called character, particularly two aspects of it. For example, one emotional intelligence ability is self-control, being able to manage your emotions. Now, that doesn't mean suppress them. You can't control what you're going to feel or when you'll feel it or what you'll feel, but rather giving children and adults, for that matter, a choice point over how you react when you feel a certain way, what you do when you're angry, for example. Well, that ability to say no to impulse has been called will in another day. That's the basis, very foundation of character, according to William James. Another emotional intelligence ability that keys into character is empathy. As I said, it's the basis of caring and compassion. When you feel with someone, ordinarily you want to help them if they're distressed. That is, feeling with them makes you want to help them. So I think in many ways emotional intelligence does feed into the aspects of character that we'd like to see in our children. On the other hand, emotional intelligence education programs are not character education. It's not a lecture about respect or values or so on. It's really giving children the core kind of generic skills they need for life in order to be good parents themselves, in order to be good marital partners, good employees, good workers, good leaders.
Let's go to the phones now, and joining us first, Tony in St. Louis.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I just thought I'd help the doc by equating emotions with a transmission in a car. It may have various switches, etc. It can be in neutral, it can spin uselessly, or it can work quite well to help move the person along their purposes and to help them survive. And so I just wanted to help the doc if I could.
Well,
thanks for that metaphor. I'd say that's absolutely true, that our emotions are what move us. I mean, our motivations in life. We do the things we love to do. Howard has written about this very eloquently in terms of an optimal kind of education, which would help children get into what could be called a flow state as they're learning, because they love what they're learning, and so they do it enthusiastically. And never thought about it as a transmission, but I think it sort of is.
Good.
Yeah, I like the notion that we often take out our emotions in the way we drive, and it can be very destructive. And probably if you had a look at just one measure of somebody's emotional intelligence, observing the driving might provide a strong clue. On the other hand, every metaphor and analogy has its problems, and I do think our emotional orchestration is a bit more complex than that of most cars.
Okay. Thanks for the suggestion, Tony.
Thank you.
Okay. Joining us now on the line is Franklin in Buffalo, New York.
Hi. When I heard about this idea, it was like a light bulb going on. It really put a lot of light on a mystery. And my question is this: are we talking about hardwiring, like neural finesse, emotional part of the brain? And if so, is there remedial work that could be done for an adult?
Well, let me speak to that, and I'm sure Howard has his own views, but generally speaking, I think that we come into life with a certain semi-hardwired set points. One of the most interesting pieces of data about this has to do with shy children. Jerome Kagan, a colleague of Howard's there at Harvard, has studied children who from the first few weeks of life can be identified as likely to be shy when they grow up. Even as infants, they're the kids who cry the most and the longest when something startling comes along. And he says that they have an overly reactive emotional brain, without going into the technicalities, and that this is true because of genetic endowment. But the interesting thing is, he says if you do nothing to shape that, then these children, by the time they get to school age, will be shy, because what they're doing is hanging back from anything new or novel, including a new kid. But if you look at children who start out that way and don't end up that way, what you find is that they have been brought up by parents who shape their response in a different way. These are parents who don't say, oh, she's shy, so we won't make her try that new toy, that new food, that new child, you know, she's too timid. But rather, they challenge their children kind of systematically, really encourage them to take the risk of playing with the new kid on the block and so on. And they do it consistently, and they do it so the child isn't overwhelmed, but actually has a positive experience of going ahead despite the little bit of fear and then having fun.
Franklin,
and if you do that consistently, those kids turn out not to be shy. And Kagan contends what you're doing really is changing the set point for alarm in their emotional brain. And
excuse me, I have to stop you now just to say that I'm Neil Conan, and you're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News. I'm sorry to interrupt. Please go ahead.
Neil, should I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, let me just finish the
thought there.
The thought, and that is that the analog applies to adults too. The way the brain shapes itself is through repeated experience. The more the brain goes through a given experience, the stronger the circuitry that supports it becomes, and the weaker the alternatives become. And it's true in adults as in children. So if you have a habit, if you're too timid as an adult, you can do the equivalent of what those parents were doing for a child and force yourself to meet new people and so on until that becomes your automatic response. And I think this is way beyond us now, but I think if we're able to look at those brains, we'd see that indeed that the circuitry had changed.
Let me raise 2 points that you mentioned in your book, Daniel Goleman, and those are one involving a group that you describe as repressors who are affected by the way their wiring in their brain works.
The repressors are people who are upset physiologically by things but don't know they are. And they seem to have a systematic delay in the transfer of information from one part of the brain to another. The interesting question is, could repressors be taught to be more attuned to how they actually feel? So, this we don't know. No one has tried.
In your definition of repressors, these are people who don't seem to react to emotional stimulus.
That's right. This is the work of Richard Davidson. That they seem to be unflappable. And Davidson, who's at Wisconsin, has found that repressors are people who actually don't really feel anxiety, even though their body, if you measure them physiologically, is giving out signals of anxiety.
And you trace this to the discovery that people have precognitive reactions, that we can begin to react to something before we're even aware of it.
Well, I think that's one of many findings that suggests that indeed the body and the brain pick up what's going on way before, in brain time, way before the thinking brain or awareness itself, before the information enters awareness. Some most interesting work was reported recently by Antonio Damasio at Iowa, where he gave people 4 decks of cards. And each time you turn over a card, you either win or lose money. 2 of the decks you would ultimately win more, but the earnings were small on each turn. The other deck you would lose, but the earnings were great. So were the penalties. It turns out that by the 20th card, people start sweating more when they're taking a card from a bad deck. By the 40th card, they start choosing more cards from the good deck than the bad. Only by the 80th turn can they tell you what's going on. So in other words, the body picked it up long before awareness knew.
I think it's interesting.
Excuse me, gentlemen, I have to say that I'm Neil Conan, and you're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News.
I just wanted to add to Dan's report of that study is that there are certain individuals, in the case of the Damasio study, there were individuals who had pathology who did not have these kind of bodily signals at all. And I've thought of them in terms of what you see when you see an individual who's just been sentenced to death showing absolutely no reactions at all. It's really quite an amazing phenomenon. And to talk about hardwiring is fine if you only mean that their lack of response or their lack of sweating is a result of something they've learned. But if you think about hardwiring in terms of people being born without the capacity to have those reactions, that would really be phenomenal. And I don't think you would find that except in the tiniest minority of cases. What probably happens is that the world over, people are born with the same range of emotions and with the same ability to show different emotions or not show them. But the culture in which you live begins to set tuning very, very quickly. And if you just think about 3 populations, I'm not going to try to define them, but Italians, Japanese, and Swedes, and you think about the modal reactivity in those particular 3 groups and how they handle situations with emotional tension, that should make it very clear that people aren't born behaving the same way in situations. It's the norms they develop with their family and school and on the street, which determines how close they'll be next to one another, what it will take to get them to fly off the handle, when they will suppress any kind of a public display of emotion, when they will show it.
Our number at Talk of the Nation is 1-800-989-TALK. That's 1-800-989-8255. Stephanie joins us on the line from Des Moines, Iowa.
Yes, hello. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
We've all been reading about the brain research for the first 3 years of a baby's life and how important that is. But one of the things that I don't seem to have heard is what sorts of activities you could share with a child and to help them reach their full potential, not to make them a little robot, but to help that particular baby reach its potential and emotionally and intellectually.
Howard Gardner, do you have any suggestions?
Sure. I think when kids are young, the most important thing is to expose them to a wide variety of experiences. I love children's museums, and they now exist in most communities in the United States, because a child can go to a children's museum. It's like a wonderful cafeteria. There are all sorts of activities the child can interact with. There are things to figure out how they work. There are works of art to play with. There are other kids who you can cooperate with, and so on. And that's the very opposite of...
Stephanie, sounds like you're asking for some practical information.
That's the very
motivated question.
Right. It's the very opposite of saying, look, I want to make my child into a mathematician no matter what, or the one thing I couldn't do in life was to play table tennis or soccer, and I'm going to make my child into that. So I think that at a young age, the important thing is to give a very wide variety, a very wide spectrum of experiences, and let him or her discover what they squeal about and what they get upset about and what they're not interested in. I'm a little bit frightened, really, of the hype surrounding the Newsweek cover story and also the Clintons' summit in Washington because I think it implied that somehow if you weren't there every moment pulling things out of your grab bag and sort of stuffing your kids with experiences, that you were being derelict. In fact, Bill Clinton kept pushing Patricia Kuehl, just how long do we have to talk to a child each day to be long enough? And I think those are the wrong questions to ask. I think the important thing is to show that you're interested in stuff and that you want to share those interests with the child and let the child show you what he or she is interested in. And one of the most important things is to leave some free time, some time to daydream, some time to explore, some time to do nothing. Because there are optimal paths of development, and while the research rightly tells us...
Dr. Gardner, I'm going to have to stop you there for just a moment. We're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News. I'm Neil Conan. My guests are Dr. Howard Gardner and Daniel Goleman. We're going to take a short break now. When we return, we'll take more of your calls. Each Thursday, we'll be reading some letters on the air, so if you have a comment or suggestion, write in, let us know. At 33 minutes past the hour, you're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, National Geographic Magazine, exploring and photographing the world's people and places. Information available at 800-NGS-LINE. And Dow Jones Business News and Information Services, featuring Dow Vision, a direct-to-the-desktop customized news service. This is NPR, National Public Radio.
I'm Neil Conan. The Senate Judiciary Committee will mark up a bill this week that reflects a growing trend to get tough on youths who commit violent crimes.
There are more murders committed by 18-year-olds than any other age group, and more rapes committed by 17-year-olds than any other age group.
A look at the juvenile crime bill and the best way to treat young offenders on the next Talk of the Nation from NPR News.
And that'll be part of tomorrow's Talk of the Nation program here on KQED-FM, San Francisco, where local underwriting for today's show is provided by photographer Joshua Etzhoken, providing an alternative to wedding photography. 415-255-8645 or www.etzhoken.com. We're getting word here at KQED Radio that Betty Shabazz, the widow of Malcolm X, has died from injuries suffered in a fire. We'll have more information at the top of the hour when we join National Public Radio for news. Again, the widow of Malcolm X, Betty Shabazz, passing away from injuries suffered in a fire earlier. And we'll update conditions for you again and provide more information with National Public Radio and their various news programs throughout the afternoon.
Welcome back. I'm Neil Conan. We're talking today about emotional intelligence. My guests are Dr. Howard Gardner, the author of Extraordinary Minds. He's a professor of education at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. And Daniel Goleman, author of Emotional Intelligence. He's a science writer at the New York Times and the author of a forthcoming book on emotional intelligence in the workplace. If you'd like to join the conversation, our number in Washington is 1-800-989-8255. That's 1-800-989-TALK. And we have a couple of questions via email, one of which I want to get to right away. Liz Lorvig asks, hello, please ask about the marshmallow test. 1/3 ate immediately, 1/3 waited. So what did the other third do?
Well, remember that they had about 10 or 15 minutes before the experimenter came back. So the comparison was between the third who grabbed that marshmallow immediately and the third who waited it out. The other third were somewhere in the middle.
Okay. Another question, could you comment on the work of Dr. Shinichi Suzuki in creating noble human beings by working on the environment around young children, and is the role in music of coordinating intelligences? That from Simon Saltz in Miami. Are either of you aware of Dr. Suzuki's work?
I actually wrote about Dr. Suzuki when I first began to study intelligences because he invented a method which we often call the Suzuki method here. It's called talent education in Japan, which got very young kids to play the violin and then later other instruments extremely well. When Westerners first heard these kids, they thought they were all geniuses. They weren't the genius. It was Mr. Suzuki who was the genius because he was a brilliant pedagogue and he really figured out ways to interest young kids in string instruments, to have them listen to what they're going to play, watch other kids, watch their parents, usually their mother, play, and then be involved in the conversation. what's amazing and very relevant to what we were speaking about earlier is that Suzuki, who's still alive, is about 100 years of age now, says he's not really trying to make musicians, he's trying to develop character. And I think what he means is that around the Suzuki performances, there's a kind of civility, a kind of respect for the music, respect for the listener, respect for the instrument, which he hopes, to use the psychological phrase, will transfer to other spheres of life. I used to be quite skeptical about the notion that music was good for other things, even though I'm a great music lover. But there's some recent research coming out of University of California in Irvine, which has made me has given me pause. And the research, which suggests that kids who learn to play a keyboard instrument when they're young, even before school, turn out to be better in some school tasks. That research suggests to me that for young kids, music may be a kind of an organizer of the rest of their life. It's orderly, it involves working on the same thing every day, involves making sense of little squiggles and pieces of paper, and that might be helpful for school. So the kind of thing that Plato and Confucius said thousands of years ago might actually have some scientific support today, and I'm sure there's some enterprising neurobiologist who's going to be looking at the brains of those little kids to see whether there's certain connections being made that aren't being made for kids, even once they're playing the computer, which is, of course, a keyboard also, and there you don't have that same transfer that they got from learning to play a keyboard instrument.
Let's go back to the phones. Tom joins us on the line from Fairfield, Connecticut.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thanks.
Good. I believe I heard earlier in the program one of your guests say, essentially, if I understood it correctly, that we have no control over our feelings. Did I hear that correctly?
It was a slight misinterpretation of what I was. It was it's Dan Goldman talking. What I said was we cannot control when our feelings come to us, by and large, nor what we'll feel. Our emotional reactions are quite automatic. What we can control is what we do when we feel a certain way.
And by those emotions, you're talking about things like fight or flight.
Well,
correct?
particularly, yeah, strong emotions like anger or sadness or anxiety.
I realize this is probably a very profound, basic question in your field. That is the behavior versus the feelings, and you all are, I'm sure, very well educated in this and trained and experienced. But my common sense life experience just leads me to disagree with you very strongly. I've known a number of people over the years who have consulted with a psychotherapist of one kind or another, and they've been convinced somehow that they have absolutely no vote or no choice in what they're going to feel when some external event or phenomenon occurs. And, for example, some of these people, when I've heard this, I've suggested to them, gosh, don't you think you have any choice in your response to your feeling, or don't you think you have any vote in that whatsoever? I mean, if not you, who decides what you're going to feel? And so many of these people I've run into, I can't believe that that's the result that the profession wants these people to experience.
Well, I don't mean to say that,
one at a time,
let me follow up. I don't mean to suggest that we're completely helpless in what we feel. What I'm saying is that, particularly when it comes to very strong, sudden, automatic reactions, things get us mad without our having full conscious control at that moment, although through methods like psychotherapy, you can change how you feel. I mean, therapy for depression, which is extreme sadness, or for anxiety, which is chronic fear, or for even anger management does work, and people can bring that under control. And in fact, in some of the very good school programs I've seen in emotional intelligence, for example, one in New Haven, Connecticut, they do a quite interesting exercise with kids in this. They, in the New Haven public schools, they have a poster on the wall of every classroom. It's a stoplight. It says, whenever you're going to get upset, remember the stoplight. Red light, stop, calm down, and think before you act. And that's very interesting, because stop is impulse control and calm down is emotional self-management. And thinking before you act does give children the understanding that, well, you're going to feel an emotion, but what you do isn't something you have no control over. You have lots of control over how you react if you can pause and then go to the second stage, which is the yellow light. It says, think of a range of different ways you can react and what the consequences would be. And then green light pick the best one. That becomes very routine in the school. It's becomes part of a child's emotional environment. Teachers use it all the time. Principals use it when kids are sent to them for being bad in class. Coaches use it. And I think it's a very good education in helping children get more control over their emotions and what emotions make them do.
Yeah, I would just add to Tom's question that what you can't do is decide today you're not going to have a reaction tomorrow. You also can't decide that in the future, if you see a terrible death in front of you, that it's not going to have any impact on you. But if you set a goal over a long period of time to, so to speak, reorchestrate your reactions or that of the kids who you have charge of as parent or as teacher, you can make a difference, but it's slow and there'll be regressions. And so I think you just want to make sure you don't assume that because you can't change something instantly, you can't change it at all. But don't go to a weekend workshop to learn to control your emotions and think you're going to be a different person next week. You're going to regress within 10 days.
Are you familiar with this phenomenon that at least I think I have observed, where these people go on unchecked by psychotherapists for extended period of times, if not, portion of their lifetime, convinced, and it almost seems as though encouraged by the psychotherapist that they have no control over their emotions. For example, maybe another person will behave in a certain way, and in an automatic nature, they interpret that in a certain way, and because of that interpretation, perhaps, they have an automatic reaction. And I know when I've experienced this, I say, gosh, well, what on earth did you do that for? Which means, what on earth did you feel that way for? Just because either someone you knew or a stranger or whoever did something. I mean, what on earth does that have to do with you?
You mean like getting angry?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
I think you might.
Okay.
I guess we both have an impulse on this one. I think that you're taking a testimony from a third party. I think that what you really would need to do is to hear what the therapist is saying, because it doesn't sound to me like any therapist would say you have no control over your emotions. That seems to be a rather senseless position. What I would say to your friend is you ought to be seeing somebody else.
Okay. Let's go back to Bob now, who joins us from Salt Lake City.
I was wondering why we can't just call empathy instead of calling it emotional intelligence. Why is it important that we use the word intelligence when we're talking about these other skills?
Well, I use the phrase, I'm guilty of using the phrase emotional intelligence in my book by that name. The theory of emotional intelligence that I use, the framework, was actually generated by two psychologists then at Yale, one Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer, who's now at the University of New Hampshire. And they used the term intelligence for the same reason that Howard uses the term intelligence is when he talks about things like musical intelligence or mathematical intelligence. I'm not equating emotional intelligence with empathy. I do use the word empathy for empathy, but empathy is one component of a larger range of skills or abilities that come under this framework of emotional intelligence. I don't mean to equate the two.
Okay.
Or reduce empathy to emotional intelligence.
Okay, you were just talking about, fifth graders were going to be looking at a red light, a yellow light, and a green light, right?
Yes.
And they were going to be trained in, I think, emotional intelligence by using that analogy?
Yes. Let me put it in a broader framework. These are kids who are in a program which is actually called the Social Development Curriculum, which is used for all 19,000 kids in the New Haven schools. The reason they brought it in New Haven is that it's a very tough place to grow up. A lot of the children there, unfortunately, live in a terrible economy. There used to be 20,000 jobs in that city, and now there are about 1,500 industrial jobs. A lot of unemployment. Right. So a lot of drug abuse, a lot of dropping out, a lot of teen pregnancies, a lot of violence. For that reason, about 6 or 7 years ago, they designed an entire curriculum which goes from kindergarten up through 12th grade and teaches children consistently a whole range of emotional skills. The stoplight is one of many, many things they do there.
Right. Okay. You're talking about emotional skills versus emotional intelligence.
Is your question about intelligence versus skill?
Yeah.
Well, this Howard Gardner, let me jump in here because, in a sense, I started this trend by appropriating a word which had been used by psychologists to refer to a fairly narrow school-based set of skills. And for 100 years, the psychological community had kind of owned the term intelligence, and like Humpty Dumpty, they could say what it meant. When I talk about multiple intelligences, I was deliberately trying to be oxymoronic. That means I was putting words together which one doesn't usually put together. And Dan and the people whom he referred to were doing the same thing with emotional, because we want to call attention to people and say, hey, wait a second. Why should it only count to be smart if you happen to be good in school, and not if you're good at finding a way around a strange place, or being able to help solve problems with other people, or being able to control your emotions, or to lead others to control their emotions in a tense situation? And there's a very profound struggle going on in our country now for who owns the term intelligence. Should there be an executive intelligence? Should there be a moral intelligence? Should there be emotional intelligence, a sexual intelligence, a planning intelligence, a cooking intelligence? What I would like to see us do is to draw the line where it's sensible, not to put intelligence in front of everything, because then it becomes meaningless, but not to save it just for repeating numbers backwards, which is a prototypical item on the Stanford-Binet intelligence test or the Wechsler intelligence test.
Maybe we should say that's what intelligence tests measure, and that these other skills and innate abilities are important as well. And I'm just always surprised when people want to appropriate the word intelligence to talk about another skill or maybe even another innate ability. I mean, I've heard people talk about motor geniuses when they talked about Tiger Woods.
But don't you realize that the first people who devised intelligence tests, they were appropriating the word too. If business people had developed the first intelligence test to be totally different from the ones that we have now, we shouldn't put up on a pedestal the fact that 100 years ago, some guys in Europe and America chose a certain number of items and said, we're going to call this intelligence. In a sense, if listeners may think of themselves as being firstborn or laterborns, I think firstborns sort of like to have things the way they are, and laterborns often want to push the envelope a bit. And I think those of us who are restive with the notion of one kind of intelligence are saying, hey, wait a second, let's let some other things in. And I'm happy to call motor ability a talent if you call gift with language a talent or gift with logic a talent. But don't put certain ones on a pedestal and say those are intelligences, those are important, and other things are mere talent or mere emotion. That's what gets me upset.
And so what you're saying is that intelligence had been put on a pedestal early on, and that's why you wanted to appropriate the word and attach it to other skills than the skills or other innate abilities or whatever that were measured by intelligence tests. That's where you're coming from. Is that right?
Sure, but neither Dan Goleman nor I sort of woke up in the morning and said, hey, these are the 5 components of emotional intelligence, or these are the 7 or 8.5 different intelligences. We had quite strict criteria for them, and I think we stand by those criteria. It's not something that you do.
Use the word intelligence? That's what I.
Well, I'll give you one answer. If I had written a book called 7 Talents, it would have been dead on arrival. By talking about multiple intelligences, it got interest, and Dan's book got fantastic interest because he called it emotional intelligence, and that's important.
I think
if you want
it's
to
a
get a
challenging
hearing.
phrase. That's right.
Yeah.
Of course, nobody mentioned the greatest oxymoron of them all, which is, of course, military intelligence. Sorry about that. I'm Neil Conan, and you're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News. Annette joins us on the line now from Ruffin, North Carolina.
Hi, yes, I am in education, and while I was on hold, I think you've already answered a lot of the question, but as an educator, I just would love to have more specifics as to what we should be doing to increase this emotional intelligence, and I happen to like the word intelligence because I see so many kids gifted in so many ways that might not do well on a so-called intelligence test.
What kind of kids do you teach?
It sounds a whole lot like the school system in New Haven. Many of the tobacco factories have shut down in Reedsville. I actually teach in Reedsville, North Carolina. A lot of drug abuse. The parents, kids are not really geared toward college. It just sounds very similar to the same situation as you were talking about earlier.
And how old are they?
I'm teaching 4th and 5th graders at intermediate school.
Okay.
That's a wonderful opportunity. Was it Annette?
Right.
Yeah. Annette, I think it's a very important question you're asking. Just as Howard is saying, we have to rethink how the emphasis we put on a narrow set of cognitive abilities. I think we need to re-envision what schools are for. If you think of the abilities children need to survive today, let alone thrive, they do need impulse control. They do have to be able to handle their anger. It's a more dangerous world. They have to know how to get along. They have to know how to care about people. These are such important skills for life that I think we need to bring them into the curriculum because they're as important as math or language abilities. It's like a teacher in Brooklyn said to me, you know, the way the standard curriculum is in schools, it's as though we're more important that our children could balance their checkbooks one day than that they be alive next week.
Right.
And for that reason, I'm very happy to see schools across the country now start what could be called emotional literacy curriculum. They're very well worked out. You can find out more about them through contacting the Collaborative for Social and Emotional Learning at the University of Illinois at Chicago. But in general, they treat emotional and social abilities as a standard topic, and they teach them from first grade on, kindergarten on. They give time in the day to it. They help children know what they're feeling and understand how one feeling leads to another. They help them handle their strong emotions that are getting them in trouble better instead of just punishing them for it. They help them learn how to be optimistic, for example, and not be, defeatist if they flunk math, but keep trying. They help them do all of these things.
Well, see, I think that is so needed, and I'm actually in physical education and have such an opportunity there to see emotions fly.
Absolutely.
We actually teach, cooperative units with the school counselor, but the things you've mentioned is just absolutely wonderful, and I do plan to look into it further. But just for teachers in general, can you give us just maybe a few key...
Well, Howard may add to this, but I would say realize that you, along with a parent's child, are the key emotional tutors for the children you're dealing with that you see every day. And whenever a child is having trouble socially, friends won't play with me and feeling bad, or whenever a child is getting upset, that's an opportunity to help that child learn something about emotional intelligence, about how to master their inner life, how to get along with other people, and use it as a learning opportunity.
Yeah, the thing that I would add is that the most important tutors will be the communities which the children see at school, and the faculty and the heads, the principals, are part of that community. And if you go into a school where children are getting along with one another and are being civil to one another, you can make a very safe wager that that's the way the adults relate to one another and to parents and people from the outside. And exactly the same in businesses. Conversely, when you have a very authoritarian situation in a school or a business, that's going to work its way out on the workplace floor or in the classroom. So it isn't teaching kids, it's embodying it and modeling it in your own lives. And of course, that's the secret of parenting or religious training too, is it doesn't work unless the religious leader or the parent walks the talk, is himself or herself emotionally civil, responsible, intelligent.
We just have about a minute left. We're going to try to get one last call in from Phyllis in Sonoma, California.
Hi, Dr. Gardner.
Hi.
You mentioned in the beginning of the air that you have now come up with 8.5 intelligences, and I'm curious to know what the other 1.5 are.
Okay.
The 8th intelligence I call naturalist. It's a sensitivity to the world of nature, living things, clouds, stones, being able to recognize patterns. Darwin, a naturalist, a hunter, a gatherer, would all have naturalist intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
The half is a bit of a tease. I think there might be something called existential intelligence, which is the human capacity to ask very basic questions like, who are we? What's going to happen to us? Why do we die? I call it half because one of my criteria for an intelligence is whether there's evidence about parts of the brain which are dedicated to that function. And so far as I know, we don't yet have any evidence for that.
Phyllis, obviously you qualify for that last one by asking what are the 8.5 intelligences. Thank you so much for your call.
You're very welcome.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank everybody who called and our guests, Dr. Howard Gardner. He's the author of Extraordinary Minds, most recently, and a professor of education at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education. He joined us from the studios of member station WGBH in Boston. Also, Daniel Goleman, the author of Emotional Intelligence, a science writer at the New York Times. He joined us from member station WFCR in Amherst, Massachusetts. Tune in to Talk of the Nation for a discussion about Major League Baseball and why there is still no permanent commissioner after 5 years. In Washington, I'm Neil Conan, NPR News.
This program is a production of National Public Radio. The views expressed are not necessarily those of NPR, the underwriters, or this broadcast station. NPR is solely responsible for this program. Tapes and transcripts of Talk of the Nation are available. Call anytime, toll-free 1-888-NPR-NEWS. That's toll-free 1-888-NPR-NEWS.